Our friend Bridge Colby joins us once again. He is a former Pentagon official. Bridge, great to have you back on the program. I'm getting people asking me this, and uh, I jumped to some pretty dark conclusions about it. So I'm wondering what you think. Here we are. Biden is, yes, technically the commander in chief, but we all, including Democrats, know that it's pretty shaky. No pun intended with that, but it's no double entendre. It's pretty shaky. And he's having a tough time understanding what's going on around him. Meanwhile, we're told that he has authorized the use of American provided long range missiles so that Ukraine can now fire missiles a couple of 100 miles. I've seen different estimates of how long these will go into Russian territory to hit Russian batteries. What is this a big deal? Why is he doing this? What's going on?
Well, great to be with you, Buck and Clay. It is honestly both disturbing and bewildering because the bizarre thing, it's almost like the sort of reductio ad absurdum of the Biden administration policy, where they're openly admitting in the New York Times that this is not going to make that much of a difference. And yet it is a very significant escalatory step. I mean, it's been talked about tremendously on the Western side, but also the Russians and Putin himself have made clear it's a big deal. But yet, the Russians have probably already adapted. They've moved their forces around. They claimed they shot down several of the ATACMS. And apparently both the Ukrainians and we are low on the ATACMS stocks. So it's this kind of, perfect encapsulation of the Biden symbolism over effectiveness policy, which is, really just, we can't get change soon enough. And I mean, this is something that I think is really important to stress here, Buck, is they have been running policy on this for obviously the last 4 years, but certainly since the beginning of 2022 and late 21, when this crisis began. And they've been working with certain Republicans who supported a maximalist sort of goals on Ukraine. And I call it the liberal primacist alliance. And now the deputy national security advisor admitted while Biden was down in Rio that the situation is extremely difficult and the Russians are willing to up the ante. Apparently, according to the Levada Center, polling, life satisfaction in Russia, including among young people, is at an all-time high. So this is just a really bad situation, and they seem to be making it worse. I think to, frankly, peer pressure, maybe the Europeans, maybe some of the, sort of the Morning Joe kind of constituency, although even they seem to be defecting from Biden.
What does a solution, I know it's like a ceasefire, a peace agreement in your mind look like? What I have been reading, Bridge, and we appreciate the time, is that it would look something like what I have seen is a 20-year agreement that NATO is not going to add Ukraine, international peace forces potentially to manage the border, whatever is negotiated as the new border of Ukraine. Is that kind of where you see this going? And I also saw a poll today, and obviously in the wake of the election, we know polls aren't always reliable, but suggesting that somewhere north, maybe 52% of Ukrainians were ready for this war to be over. Do you buy in that Trump in the first 90 days or so can get a solution? And if so, what does that solution look like?
Well, look, I don't want to get ahead of the president. I think he seems to have a somewhat of his own idea that he's not tipped his hand, which makes sense from a negotiating point of view. I would just say, looking at history, we've got to be realistic and looking at the situation on the ground. I don't think we can be expecting that like Crimea is going to come back. And I think we should be realistic. And I think the fact that the Ukrainians are now looking for an end to the war, but just objectively, given the enormous human suffering and the fact that the war is not going very well, together means some kind of ceasefire or cessation of the conflict that's realistic. These conflicts tend to end somewhere along the battle lines as they exist. Unfortunately, the Russians are making progress, but there's reason to think that the Russians might not want this war to go on forever. It's obviously causing them pain at home, although they seem to be willing to manage it. It's making them more dependent on China. It's closing them off from the West and Europe. So I think, and Putin has seemed to be at least open, and his lieutenants like Peskov, to at least some, hearing out their proposals. And this war has been going on for almost 3 years. So, I very much hope, and I think you've seen, frankly, the reality, obviously, sort of lemming-like you had the Western leaders and Biden saying, oh, this war can't end, it's got to go on as long as it takes. And then as soon as Trump receives this decisive electoral mandate from the American people, Olaf Scholz, the chancellor of Germany, is calling Putin. and you see the shift in the popular opinion in Ukraine. So what it looks like exactly, I don't know. I don't want to get ahead of the president for sure. But I think we've got to be realistic. This, to me, again, guys, is what I would stress is I think we've got to calibrate. We as the American people have got to calibrate expectations. Things are being left in such a bad state by the Biden-Harris administration that we've got to be realistic. You're not, the Russians have spilled an enormous amount of blood in, yes, an aggressive and unjustified attack into Ukraine. But this is the real world, and we'd be better off dealing with the real world, as President Trump is always pointing out, and having avoided this conflict rather than the kind of moralism of Joe Biden and Tony Blinken. And what I would say is on the NATO issue, I personally don't think that Ukraine should be in NATO. So I don't know why we would reserve the right even for 20 years. What's the point of reserving something for 20 years? That's like way down the pike in strategic planning and diplomacy terms. So I think we should be prepared to negotiate on a range of issues in order to bring this conflict to an end.
Bridge, I see something troubling that I know the incoming Trump administration is going to have to confront and hopefully untangle. It seems that there is an axis, a de facto axis that is forming, and you can almost see it like a cycle or like some kind of an assembly line. You've got Russia selling its oil, a lot of it to China and to other actors. And you've got North Korean soldiers who are fighting now on the front lines in Russia. You've got Iranian drones, these Shahed drones being used on the front lines in Ukraine. Or rather, that's also where the North Koreans are fighting, obviously, in Ukraine, but on behalf of the Russians. And so you have all this, I don't know what to say, these kind of oppositional states that are collaborating and seeming to get closer militarily and economically, Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, than we've seen in a long time. And I think that's worrisome. How do you see that, and how do you think Trump can approach that?
Well, it's very worrisome. And I think, I hate the term axis of evil because it harkens back to the disastrous policy of the early 2000s. But I call it like a counter coalition or something. That's sort of a lame way of putting it. But excuse me. But I think you're absolutely right that there is a coalition of states that have come together. Frankly, that Biden, his policy, through the rhetoric, through its behavior, has actually driven them further and further. And the administration has sort of admitted that. Blinken has admitted that the Russians have been helping the Iranians. They've been helping the Chinese on things like submarine warfare, which is very important. The North Korean nuclear and missile program. Of course, you mentioned the other things in the other direction. So I think, look, what can we do? I think we can be selective about how we apply our military. So we're strong in the right places, particularly Asia. I think we can get our allies to do more and really do that. And you already see that happening. You see Trump, common sense breaking out all over the place with Trump's election. Taiwan saying it might spend more on defense, Germany moving in that direction, hopefully maybe the United Kingdom, Australia, et cetera. That's another piece. And then a more pragmatic and flexible diplomacy that harkens back to the successful Republican foreign policy of Reagan, Nixon, Ike, et cetera, which is Jim Baker is being prepared to negotiate with our rivals and opponents, both to avoid conflict, excuse me, but also to potentially, drive wedges is a little ambitious, but maybe create fissures and uncertainties amongst them that causes problems. And that, I think, is kind of how we go. If you look at how, say, the Indians conduct their foreign policy, it's much more successful than the Joe Biden approach.
Bridge, how much do you think, and I know we've talked about this before, but Putin invading Ukraine, Hamas attacking Israel on October 7th, was just complete and total disrespect for Joe Biden in the wake of our withdrawal from Afghanistan? And how much do you think merely Trump being elected changes the calculus of Americans' foreign policy adversaries, whether it's China, Russia, Iran, or North Korea?
Well, I think, Clay, it's a big one. And I think, the Afghanistan thing is very important. And it was a seminal event. But I think sometimes some of the kind of neoconservative voices say, oh, it was such a disaster, we should have stayed there till the end of time. I don't think that's right. And that's what President Trump has said as well. I think what Afghanistan showed is it told people a lot about Joe Biden and how he would make decisions. And I think Donald Trump's a very different guy. He's tough. He's unpredictable. But he's also prepared, and he's prepared to do tough and sharp and nasty things. In some circumstances, he's going to put the American people first. He's willing to break China, excuse me, so to speak, to achieve successful outcomes, but he's also prepared to negotiate and be flexible. So I think you could see quite significant changes right away, and I think you already see that both on the part of our allies, but also on the part of potential opponents. The fact that he's willing to talk to potentially Putin, Kim Jong-un, Xi Jinping, that's good. That gives us leverage, it gives us negotiating space, and it creates tensions among them.
Bridge Colby, everybody. Bridge, hoping that you will perhaps be helping the incoming Trump administration prevent World War III, which I think is a bipartisan. Like, we could all get behind that. Like, let's not do World War III. And I hope
that I'm definitely behind that. Well, no presumptions,
yeah.
but I'm honored, friends. I really appreciate it. No presumptions.
No World War III.
Whatever happens to me, I want to try to avoid World War III. I'm into that, guys.
Yes, I figure you're down with it. I'm just going to give you. I want to give you some tactical advice now, Bridge. Ginger, fresh ginger, grated, hot water, a little bit of honey, going to help with that throat a lot. You got to take care of yourself, buddy.
Thank you.
You're out there talking and stopping wars.
It.
But Strategy of Denial is his book. Bridge Colby, thanks for being with us.
Thank you, guys. Pleasure.
Look, there's going to be some great sales going on this holiday season at Legacy Box, Chattanooga, Tennessee-based company, digitally transfers old media like videotapes, film reels, slides, print photos, and more so you can preserve old memories for generations to come. Right now, 65% off their regular prices with a $9 per videotape sale. Just go to legacybox.com to get started. Super easy process. They do all the work, and the great thing about digitizing old media is you can easily share the files, convenient when families far apart, or if someone is in the hospital and could use a little pick-me-up. If you don't have a family member in the service that won't be home for the holidays, how about if you do have something to send them, digital files that could make a difference to somebody who's far away from home, whether they're in the military or elsewhere. The smiles, the laughs, Legacy Box can preserve them all. Go to legacybox.com/clay for this $9 per tape deal. That's legacybox.com/clay.